Hi, welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice, and today my guest is Stephen Kimber, and we're going to talk about his book and about the events surrounding Flight 111, the tragedy of the Swiss air crash. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, Leslie.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
The crash had a very profound effect on the people of Nova Scotia. Could you describe that?
I'm not sure that it's necessarily different than the kind of effect a crash like this would have on a lot of places. I mean, and certain things that happened, the fishermen rushing out to try and save people, are things that have happened in other similar sorts of crashes. But I think because Nova Scotia is small and intimate, and I think the nature of the place in a way, people wanted to help. They had that sense of reaching out, that these were people who were coming from away who needed our help. I'm talking now about the families after the crash. And everybody, it seems, I mean, was involved in some small way or another, and everybody was affected in some small way or another. And even if you weren't involved, you know where you were when. I mean, it's a kind of Kennedy assassination kind of moment for a lot of people. You know, how did you hear about it? What were the first things you heard? And it goes from there. I think that's definitely been true.
And the flip side of the coin seems to be that the people of Nova Scotia had a profound effect on the victims' families as well. Absolutely.
There's some marvelous stories of people here reaching out to families, and then it being reversed, that the families in fact have become friends with people from Nova Scotia who participated in either the rescue attempt or later the recovery.
Take me through, if you will, the final moments of Flight 111.
Well, nobody knows for sure, and I think it's important to keep in mind that the investigation is still ongoing. There are things that we do know. One is that it probably lost power about 6 minutes from the time that it crashed. There was about a 6-minute period. Now, the best and perhaps hopeful guess is that the people in the passenger area of the plane really didn't know what was going on. Just to try and sort of set that up for you, there was smoke in the cockpit. They diverted from, well, originally they were going to go to Boston, but then the air controller said, Halifax is closer, so they were going to land in Halifax. The pilot had the chief flight attendant announce to the passengers that they were diverting to Halifax. There was going to be an emergency landing in about 20 minutes. And as a result of that, they started collecting the trays. Now, immediately in an emergency like that, or even a low-level emergency like that, they turned out the cabin lights because they're not necessary to the operation of the plane. So the cabin was in darkness. The trays were being collected by flashlight. People would be a little nervous, understandably, in that situation, but they wouldn't panic, I don't think, given that. When the power went out, it didn't really affect them directly because they didn't have power. They didn't see. And because they were in darkness, they wouldn't necessarily know until perhaps even the last second that the plane was going to crash.
Is that right? They wouldn't feel a dramatic descent?
No, because there was kind of an optical illusion or a lack of optics in this. You don't see land, you don't see the sky because it's dark, there are no lights. You just really don't see anything. So when you're traveling like that, you can have the illusion that you're going up when you're in fact going down. And that may have been part of the problem for the pilots, is because they didn't have any of the usual either visual or mechanical, electrical references to the horizon or anything else. The sense is that they probably went into a spiral. When they went into a spiral, that's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It begins, and if you don't know what you're doing, you go a little bit faster and a little bit faster, and then suddenly you're going in and you can't get out of it. The expectation is that it probably went into the ocean nose first, about anywhere from 350 to 500 miles per hour. It was going so fast, and the G-forces were such that, and we think that, or I thought...
So it's like hitting concrete.
Hitting concrete, we think of water as being forgiving, but it's not. This all happened within about 3 feet of the surface of the water. Within about a third of a second, the nose of the plane met the tail of the plane. So if you can imagine that all happening in a third of a second, almost telescoping into itself, you can understand why the bodies were in the condition they were in and why the plane itself was in the condition it was.
That's quite an incredible situation. When I look at that map of the flight path, it almost would appear that if the plane had gone straight for the Halifax airport instead of heading out to sea, somehow they could have landed. I don't know.
I think
Any truth to that?
Well, there's lots of speculation about that and lots of second guessing, but that's really what it is.
That's
I mean, the fact of the matter is that it could have worked the opposite way. Perhaps if they'd gone for the airport rather than going out to sea a little bit to dump fuel, which was their intention, dump some fuel, come back in lighter and make a safer landing. Perhaps if they'd come in with a full load, maybe they could have landed safely, but maybe they would have hit a fireball, created a fireball when they landed and gone off 1.5 miles through the woods, which was certainly possible, and into a residential area. It could have been much worse, or it could have landed in the city of Halifax. We don't know. You know.
Yeah. Stephen, who were the first searchers on the scene that night?
The fishermen were of the area. I mean, it's interesting. It's almost like an instinctive reaction. How
did they know about it?
Well, different ways. Robert Conrad, who was a tuna fisherman from Fox Point, had come home. He was dog-tired from having worked a 15-hour day, and he laid down on the couch to watch a little television, fell asleep. When he woke up, the TV was on, and they were talking about this air accident. He perked up his ears, and then he heard Blandford, which is right where he was, and he immediately said to his wife, "I'm on my way." And another fisherman that I talked to got a call from a neighbor who had heard it, circuitous routes. Some people heard the noise and thought and realized that it was a crash of a plane and went out. But there were several dozen boats that went out that night. And
so they're going out at midnight or something like
midnight
that?
In Hurricane Danielle is passing by.
Yes.
It's not nice weather, but it is. It's really an instinct to go and help people at peril on the sea. I mean, that's a standard sort of operating procedure for fishermen and sailors. And when they went out there, I mean, I think that many of them thought, for example, that it might be a private plane, a small private plane. They were looking at something small like that, or that they were going to find survivors. And this is a really sort of instinctive reaction that you get from fishermen.
But it's the middle of the night.
Middle of the night. It was the middle of the night. It was right in the midst of Hurricane Danielle, which was passing by offshore, so it was causing a lot of chop in the water. It wasn't a nice night at all. But people do this sort of thing. They just basically go out to look for people in peril on the sea, and it's age-old tradition of sailors and fishermen, and it doesn't matter whether it's a fishing boat or it's a plane. I mean, they're out to try and help. And I think it was a terrible disappointment to them when they found that there was nobody.
You want to be
save.
a rescuer. You want somebody
That's right.
to rescue.
And for a lot of them, it was incredibly traumatic. They went out and they got to the scene, and the debris field, you could smell the jet fuel, pieces of the plane, as small as Time magazine covers is what one person described it to me as, and bits of things floating by, passports, books, things that people had carried on the plane. A lot of stuff disfigured and dismembered, and body parts and that sort of stuff. It was very traumatic. I mean, it was not what they expected when they went out there. It wasn't what they bargained for. Some of them, I think, had a very difficult time even dealing with it that night. And of course, later there were even more problems in trying to just come to grips with what they'd seen.
There were very few actual victims to pick up out of the sea, complete dead bodies. Even.
There was only one intact body from the entire plane. And when you think about that, that's, these were 229 people aboard that plane. And there were some heart-wrenching kinds of scenes. So, Robert Conrad, the fisherman from Fox Point who went out there that night, when he went out, he knew, because he was a little late getting out into the water, that there weren't going to be survivors. And so he had to decide for himself, do I really do this? I mean, am I going out there to be a gawker or a rubbernecker, or can I actually help? His decision was really based on having watched a documentary about a woman who had made it her life's work, I guess, to be with people who had no one else when they were dying. And so he decided that what he wanted to do was go out there and try to be with someone in their final moments. Now, clearly they were dead, but sort of that give them that kind of respect and dignity in their final moments. And because he was all alone on his boat, he couldn't have carried in a big part of a body or anything else. He found a little baby, one of two babies aboard the plane, and he brought it aboard. And he didn't have a blanket on his boat, so he called one of the other boats and got them to give him a blanket so he could wrap this baby who was naked, and held on to it until the sailors from the Preserver, the HMCS Preserver, which was sort of the main vessel out there, arrived on their launch to pick up the body and take it off to the ship. So that, it was pretty pretty
It's a
horrific
pretty
stuff.
profound kind of
Yes.
experience. I guess all of us here in Nova Scotia were pretty profoundly affected by it. It was maybe 60, 70 miles from where I live at Lawrencetown Beach, a long way away. And a few days afterwards, with a west wind blowing, parts of the plane started washing in, and I saw my own personal connection to this thing. And this is the inside cabin wall, presumably. And every time I get in a plane, if I look at that wall, I think of these pieces that I found there on the beach. In some small way, it changed me. But you've done heavy research into the lives of the people affected here, and I wonder, what do you take away from it yourself? I mean, how does it personally change you to get that deep into this story?
I'm not sure that I know yet. In some ways. When I got into this, I was not involved in any of the good works that were done in the days after the crash. I wasn't somebody who went out, and I wasn't somebody who volunteered later, but I watched all of that. And the night after the crash, I was listening to the radio, and they were sort of announcing the names of some of the prominent people who had died on the crash. And one of the names was a name I knew. It was vaguely. I mean, I'd met this guy 25 years ago for 10 minutes, but he was a very good friend of my brother-in-law. And suddenly I realized that, hey, these are real people. These are, people with spouses and families and friends and all that. They're not just names on a passenger list. And so, in part, what I wanted to do was to find out more about some of these people aboard the plane. And I also wanted to find out how people in Nova Scotia had been affected, as well as the families of the people who died. Just what an event like this does to people. And that was in about October that I started, and I had a bunch of other things going, and I was also doing a full-time job. And so it was really intense, and you just focused on the doing of it. Now that it's finished, and now that the book is out, I'm starting finally to sort of sit back and I guess in a sense be affected by what I've heard. And I think the one thing that you come away from in this kind of thing is the fragility of life. You have a really profound sense that tomorrow, in 10 seconds, you could be gone, and it could be all over. And you think of a wonderful woman, a woman from New York who's lost her daughter on this plane, Nancy White. Her 18-year-old daughter was going off to school in Switzerland. Like most of us who are parents, you have your occasional little battles and fights, and she had a fight with her daughter, and she didn't go to the airport the night that her daughter went on the plane.
I remember that story from the book, and thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, and you sort of think, I mean, to me, I guess what you take away from this is when you do sort of separate from somebody for a moment, you're sort of always conscious of the fact that this is a possibility. I mean, it's a terrible thing for her to carry with her, unfair thing. I mean,
she'll never forget it. It's a weight
she'll never forget it. But in fact, let's face it, it's an unfair thing that anybody should have to carry, because we are all those things can happen to any of us. But you have to sort of keep that in mind. I think that's what really hit me the most about this.
And there would have been dozens of those kinds of stories, some which you tracked down and some which are out there.
Which are still out there, yeah. Absolutely.
We're going to take a short break. My guest is Stephen Kimber, and we'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Off the Page. My guest is Stephen Kimber. We're talking about the crash of Flight 111 Swiss Air and the book that Stephen's written. What do we know about the pilot?
Not a huge amount, in the sense that Swiss Air, while it's given out sort of the basic information, hasn't really sort of allowed us a great window into his life. We know certain things. He was 50 years old. He was well trained. He was a trainer of other pilots on this MD-11 flight. He had in fact come over 2 years earlier from another part of the Swiss Air fleet. He'd been encouraged to come over and join the MD-11 flight, which was where he was the captain. And he had a wife and 3 children who were alive. They had another child who had died earlier, and it was sort of a very profound effect on them. He was about to turn 50. He would have been 50 about 2 2 or 3 days after that flight, and his family had a big celebration planned for him. So you sort of find out about those things, and you start to realize another
The
sort
interruption of life. It just
human
can
story.
stop anytime.
One of the interesting things about that, which is not in the book, is that his wife Priska had been a flight attendant with Swiss Air, and she had given up that job to look after their children. But Swiss Air and flying was very important in that family, and it was a window on the world for them. And so even though she was no longer flying, she was still very involved and very interested. And even before he died, she was trying to get back into the airline to continue to be a flight attendant. They turned her down because she was too old at this point to start again, I guess. But after the crash, I think about 6 months after the crash, she reapplied again. And I think because of the circumstances, they felt they couldn't turn her down. So she, in the spring of 99, came back and became a part-time flight attendant with Swiss Air. And her first flight was the flight between New York and Geneva. So.
Wow. What kinds of, just if you can kind of compress the story, what kicks in when a crash like this happens? What are the official services that go to work?
Well, since 1996, I guess it is, there have been rules in place that require airlines and to determine how they notify families and all of that sort of stuff. And I mean, it's strange. We think that should be a fairly simple, routine kind of thing, but in fact, it's not. I mean, who is a next of kin? Is it the second ex-wife or the first ex-wife or the brother-in-law who doesn't like the sister-in-law?
Yes.
I mean, who do you actually have to notify? And then in addition to that, there are questions like, how do you deal with the reality, as Swiss Air found out very quickly, that a plane crash can't be kept quiet. It's big news, and you have no control over it. So
and people are going to find out before they're contacted.
Most people found out before they were contacted, and some people found out in really horrific ways. I mean, another family lost their daughter, their 16-year-old daughter, who was flying to Switzerland that night. She was supposed to phone when she got into Geneva at 3 in the morning, and she didn't call, and so they woke up at 6, and the wife says to the husband, we should find out what's going on. She hasn't called, and it's not like her not to call. So he said, okay, I'll go check their website, the Swiss Air website, and get a phone number, and we can phone and find out what the latest story is. He opened the website, and there was the press release from Swiss Air announcing the crash. Yeah. That was how he found out. Now, that's not Swiss Air's fault, and a number of families have come to blame Swiss Air for not responding fast enough or well enough. But it's part of the reality that we live within sort of the global communications setup that we have. These things happen.
How do the families begin to cope, if it's the loss of a husband or a child or something like that? How do they really begin to pull their lives back together? You must have spoken or done some research about the grief counselors and this sort of thing.
I think that it really depends very much on the individuals involved. I think there are people who, everybody's life was dramatically altered by that crash. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. Perhaps the further you get away from the epicenter of the crash in terms of families, it becomes less. But I think it had a pretty profound effect. And I think that for some people, it intensified the kind of things that they might feel anyway. Anger. There's at least one woman who's basically made it her life's work now to make Swiss Air pay, and not necessarily in monetary terms, but she wants recognition that they did something wrong, and she's going to spend her life and any money that she makes from a settlement in her suit against Swiss Air to fund that, to go for air safety. Other people have, I guess in a strange sort of sense, begun to move on. They have had their memorial services, they have the memories, they are treating it as an accident, one of those terrible, horrific things, and they'll never forget it, but they're beginning to reassemble the daily life that they led before. Yes. I think that's probably the majority of people, but there are certainly people who may never recover from this.
There's a very heavy effect on the families, and it turns out there's a very heavy effect on the individuals involved in the rescues, like you were mentioning the fishermen. There were divers who went into the wreckage, and I remember just their comments saying that it was just horrific. It was just a nightmare.
They describe, people asked them what was it like down there, and they tried and essentially failed to describe the horror of it. One person said it was like hell. And I think that was probably what would be the closest, when you listen to the specific descriptions. You know, there were body parts mixed in with plain pieces, and what they had to do was to get them and get this stuff up to the surface. And they were operating, because of the depth, they'd go down and they'd have maybe 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes of clear time where they could, explore and look for.
And lots of jagged metal.
Lots of jagged metal pieces. I mean, one false move and it would be 230 people who were dead, and not 229. And so, and they were working against time because the currents. I mean, they were desperately trying, first of all, to find the body parts, because that was the most important thing from everybody's point of view, but also pieces of the plane, because how do we figure out what went wrong here? That's a really difficult question,
I don't understand, and part of me doesn't understand the need to collect all the body parts. We know a person is dead. It's an absolute fact. There's nobody who's survived this. Why is that this human necessity to do that act?
I'm not sure. There certainly is. And I know that the coroner's office, the medical examiner's office here, wrestled with that, because at the very beginning, they were going to DNA everything. I mean, they were going to sort of bring it all up and DNA, and then they got to the point where, well, there's only so many things that you can do. And there's still arguments going on with some families that they don't have all of their family member to bury. And one of the things that happens at the end of this process is there are a whole bunch of body parts that have not been identified or assembled with the body and are being buried separately.
Right.
And that's caused some concern for some families. But why we have this need, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a sort of one of the terrible things about a crash is that you don't get a body back that you can call your relative and say this is the person. Right. So I think there's a desire to get as much back as absolutely possible.
Difficult human condition.
Yeah.
We're going to take one final break and come back and talk with Stephen Kimber after this. You've been watching Off the Page. My guest today has been Stephen Kimber. We've been talking about Flight 111, Swiss Air tragedy happened here in the waters of Nova Scotia. Stephen, is air travel going to be any safer as a result of this crash and the investigation that followed?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think, it depends on whether they find a specific cause for the crash and whether they can fix that problem, whatever it was. The investigators are certainly doing their best to try. I mean, one of the investigators that I profile in the book comes from Ottawa, and he's been here in Nova Scotia. He'd been in here in Nova Scotia when I talked to him in May for 8 months. He'd been home for 4 times in those 8 months, twice just to pick up clothes, to come back, and he's spending 7 days a week at it. But it's a terribly difficult thing to try and figure out exactly, specifically, what went wrong, because they got to sort of go back and find the trigger for what went wrong. I think that we can probably feel relatively safe when we fly a plane. I mean, the statistics do indicate that. It's but if your number is up, I'm afraid.
Well, that's
one of those things.
It's a sad place to end it, but there we are.
Sorry.
Stephen, thanks for coming on the show and talking about this.
Thanks very much.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.